Hi, I'm Chad with Move for Guitar. This lesson is from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to give you an introduction to the modes of the major scale. First off, if you like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this e-guide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. This is part 5.1 from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So this is a whole new section where I'm going to dive into the modes of the major scale. And the modes are an extremely important subject if you really want to get into music theory and understand music. And the problem with learning modes for a lot of people is that a lot of teachers either oversimplify or overcomplicate them. They can either be oversimplified to the point where you don't understand the use of them, why you would even need to understand them at all, or they can be overcomplicated to the point where they just seem like rocket science and something that you'll never fully grasp. So I'm going to do my best to really keep this simple, but not oversimplified to the point where you won't even understand why I'm teaching you these, because the modes are an important subject and they're a fairly simple concept. Although you can get pretty deep into them, the more advanced you get, the more you learn about theory, and especially when you get into more advanced music like jazz. But the overall concept and starting out with the modes does not have to be that hard to understand. And I'm going to keep it fairly simple to start off in this section and then dive deeper into them in other sections when we get into more advanced theory. But like I said, it's a simple concept. I think if you follow through this section that you'll have a good grasp of the modes of the major scales, although it's probably not going to just click automatically because it usually doesn't for most people, just like music theory in general. So don't get frustrated as you're going through. Just go through this whole section and then go back and watch it again if you have to. I think it's another thing where you kind of have to go forward and then come back a little bit to fully understand what's going on. And if you've come this far in this series, you already have a good foundation of the modes. I didn't really explain that I was talking about the modes. I mentioned it in passing, but a lot of what I talked about when we were talking about building chords and different stuff with the major scale, we were actually getting into mode theory. I just didn't talk about the modes because I didn't want to overcomplicate what we were talking about in those lessons. So as we're going through here, I'll explain how you already have a good foundation if you've come this far through this series. So all a mode is a scale that's derived from a parent scale. And since we're talking about the major scales, it's a scale that's derived from a parent major scale. And that may sound confusing, but this is something we actually went over through this series already. And this is where I'm going to explain how you already have the foundation if you've come this far. So on your screen right now is an F major scale. It doesn't matter that it's in F right now because all we're looking at is the intervals. I just put it in F like I've done before so I can have more room on the fretboard. So you know that to build a major scale, it's just whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. And the intervals you get are root, major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, and then you're back to root. So technically, this is the first mode of the major scale. The first mode of the major scale starts on the first note of the major scale. And we'll get into its name later, but just know that the major scale is actually the first mode of the major scale, which might be a little confusing, but it'll make more sense as we go through. And then if you'll remember, as we were building triads or we were building seventh chords, we would build a chord starting on the first note of the major scale, and that would give us a major or a major 7. And then we changed the second note of the major scale to the new root, had all the other intervals correspond to the new root, and we built a new chord off that, which on the second note of the major scale gave us a minor triad or a minor 7 chord. And when we did that, we were actually building the second mode of the major scale. So if we take the second note of the major scale, make it our root, and then have all the other intervals correspond to this new root, like we did when we were building chords, we've built the second mode of the major scale. So what becomes our flat 7 was our root of the major scale, which is the first mode of the major scale. Now we're on the second note of the major scale. We make that our new root. All the other notes correspond to the new root. This is the second mode of the major scale if you start on this root and end on this root. And then we went to the third note of the major scale and did the same thing. We made the third note of the major scale our new root, made all the other intervals correspond to the new root. What was our original major scale was right here. You know, you have your whole step, half step, and so on. And this is your third mode of the major scale. So the first part of understanding modes is that simple, and you already understand that concept because we did this when we built chords. So technically, when you play a major scale from the root to the root, you've played the first mode of the major scale. When you play the major scale from the second note to the second note, which becomes your new roots, you've played the second mode of the major scale, and so on, all through the notes of the major scale. So there are 7 modes of the major scale because you have 7 notes of the major scale. And so you might wonder, what's even the point of the modes? Well, first off, modes give different colors. So if you're on the first mode of the major scale, which is just the major scale, you end up with these intervals. All these intervals have different colors. The spaces between all these intervals just add different colors, and a major scale adds a pretty bright color because you have the major third, the major seventh, and there's no minor intervals or diminished intervals, so it's a pretty bright sound. Then when you build it off the second note of the major scale, you end up with the minor third, which you know because you end up with a minor chord and a minor seventh, so that is a darker sound. Or if you do it from the third note of the major scale, it's a fairly dark sound because you end up with a flat 2, a flat 3, a flat 6, and a flat 7. And those are intervals that create darker sounds or more dissonant sounds. And it's a little tough if you just were to take the F major scale, play from F to F, that's the first mode, and then start on G and play from G to G and try to hear the differences. That's really hard to actually be able to hear when you do it that way because our ears are so accustomed to hearing the major scale. It kind of just sounds like when you play from G to G, it wants to go back to F to resolve. So the way you would really be able to hear it is if you took a major 7 chord and played from F to F, the F major scale, you'd really be able to hear the quality of the major scale or the first mode of the major scale. Then if you took a minor 7 chord and played from G to G, you'd really be able to hear the quality of the second mode of the major scale because it's corresponding to that new chord. And that's what you do with modes. Modes are used to improvise over chords. Modes, you build chords out of the modes like we've done already, but then those are also used to improvise or solo over different chords. For example, you would use the major scale or the first mode of the major scale to solo over major chords or major 7th chords. You'd use the second mode of the major scale to solo over minor chords or minor 7 chords. And you may be saying, well, what's the point if you're talking about modes and they all have the same notes? For example, if we're in the key of F, every mode has the same notes as the key of F. No matter what note I start on, we're still going to end up with the same notes of F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, and back to F. It's just we're starting and ending on a new note. So how does that even make sense? Well, you're creating a new tonal center. So if you're playing the major scale, this is your tonal center. It's really revolving around that. If you start on the second note and that becomes your second mode, you're creating a tonal center around this note. So that's the first concept behind it. But also, when you play an F major scale over a C major 7 chord or a C major chord, when you're soloing with it, you end up with the fourth note not sounding very good over it. It's what's called an avoid note, which we'll talk about more later. So you know that when you're playing the first mode of the major scale over a major chord or a major 7 chord, you end up with the fourth interval not sounding very good, so you don't want to land on it when you're soloing. But when you're soloing over a minor 7 chord with the second mode, what was the fourth of the F major scale or the first mode is now the flat 3 of the second mode. They're both a B flat note. So it was B flat with the first mode, it's B flat with the second mode, but in the first mode it was a fourth interval compared to the root. In the second mode it's a flat 3 interval compared to the root. Well, that flat 3 when you're soloing over a minor 7 or a minor chord sounds really good because you know that to build a minor chord or minor triad is a root flat 3 5. So that flat 3 is actually in the chord and sounds really strong. So that's another aspect of modes, is understanding how they work over chords when you're improvising, because even though you're using the same notes, those notes are going to sound different, either good or bad, over different chords. So what's the same notes, the F major scale over a major chord or a major 7 chord sounds one way, but the F major scale over a minor 7 or a minor chord sounds another way, and you need to be able to recognize where your tonal center is to revolve around that, and you also need to be able to recognize what intervals are going to sound good when you're improvising. And that may be confusing. We're going to get more into this as we go through, so don't worry about if that's super confusing right now. It'll all make sense as we go through, but it is an important thing to at least get in your mind to what the point of the modes are to begin with. If you're talking about a major scale and then all the modes coming out of that same scale so they end up having the same notes, you really have to start thinking about the intervals and how they relate to the chords. And also I should point out, I mentioned that each mode has a parent major scale. So the first mode of the major scale is just the major scale, so there's no parent major scale. So if you're playing an F major scale, that's the first mode of the major scale, and it's just an F major scale. If you're playing from the second note of the F major scale, the parent major scale of this second note, which is G, so this is the second mode of the major scale and it starts on G. The parent major scale is the original major scale, which was F. And that's the same for every mode you build out of the F major scale. So if you start on the third note and build a scale, that's the third mode. The F is still the parent major scale, which we'll talk more about that as we go through as well, but it's important to start understanding that concept as well. And I just want to point out the names of the modes before we move on, even though you're not going to be able to memorize this really quickly. Most people won't be able to just memorize it really quickly because they have strange names, and there's 7 of them. But it's important to at least see these names because we're going to keep going over and over them as we're going through these lessons, and eventually you will memorize them and the order of them. So your first mode, which is just the major scale, is Ionian. So if we're in F major, we started on the F note, played to the other F note, all the intervals corresponding to that F note. It's the F major scale, but it's also called Ionian. Your mode that's built off the second note of the major scale is called Dorian. The note that's built off the third note is Phrygian. The mode that's built off the fourth note is Lydian. The mode that's built off the fifth note is Mixolydian. Sixth note, Aeolian, and seventh note, Locrian. So these are Greek names that it doesn't matter where they come from, but these are the names that are used, and they're very common names, so they are important to eventually memorize and memorize the order of. But these are all in your e-guide to look up, and like I said, you don't need to memorize it right now. It's just important to now get the names in your head a little bit, be introduced to them, because we're going to keep going over them as we go through these lessons. And then if we took this chart that you're familiar with, I've just added the modes right here. So the first mode is Ionian, the second mode's Dorian, the third mode is Phrygian, which is built off the first note of the major scale, second note of the major scale, third note of the major scale, and so on. So if I was in the key of C, the first mode is Ionian, or it's just a C major scale, which starts on C and ends on C. The second mode is Dorian, which starts on D, ends on D, and so on. Just like we did when we were talking about relative minor, we just rearranged the order of the notes to correspond with the relative minor starting and ending on the sixth note. So it's the same concept. And if you may remember that when I talked about the relative minor, I mentioned it was also called the Aeolian mode, which it is. So that's one of the modes. But if this is super confusing to you, don't worry. It's going to make sense as we go through. This is something you'll have to come back to often and review. Just like music theory, we have to go forward a little bit and then come back, and eventually all the gaps will be filled in. And I'm going to give you lots of ways to look at the modes and understand them. So everything I talked about, I'm going to cover in depth as we go through these lessons. So in the next couple lessons, I'm going to talk about the difference between looking at modes in series and modes in parallel. So this next lesson, we're going to look at modes in series. and this is going to be really beneficial for opening up your eyes to how modes work. So go ahead and move on to that lesson. Be sure to download the e-guide. All these diagrams are in there, and be sure to subscribe because we add at least one new lesson every day.